Good afternoon everyone. My name is Nurul Habaib and today I'm going to represent our paper within the title of Availability of COVID-19 Vaccine, Regulation and Indonesian Policy to deal with it. Next slide please. So if you remember the MERS-CoV virus, which was also declared as an epidemic in 2014, then coronavirus disease or COVID-19 is a branch of that virus. It all started in December 2019 when it was the first identified case in Wuhan, China, and the casualties are rising and rising till January 2020. It was declared as a global pandemic by the World Health Organization, or you may recognize it as WHO. But it doesn't stop there. The number of cases are rising and rising till March 2020. It was declared as the first identified case in Indonesia and declared as non-natural disaster through Presidential Decree number 12/2020. And currently, it contaminates 188 countries around the world and infecting 3 million of people every day. Next slide, please. This situation is not only urging the scientists, but also urge the government to create a policy in order to mitigate the COVID-19 transmission, starting from forming COVID-19 task force, declaring COVID-19 as non-natural disaster, initiating large-scale social restriction, which we are currently experiencing it due to the fact that we should work or study from home remotely, and the last is the temporary travel ban policy. Next slide, please. This situation is not only urging the government, but also urge the scientists and pharmaceutical companies to try to discover a vaccine that could be the major answer for this situation. So, according to the WHO data on September 2020, there are 35 COVID-19 vaccine candidates, and I would like to give 3 examples of it, which is Sinopharm, Sinovac, and Sputnik vaccine, which is currently undergoing the 3rd phase of clinical trial before attaining the emergency use authorization. Next slide, please. So in our paper, there are 3 problems that we are identified, as you can see in your screen. And the research method is actually the normative legal approach with qualitative analysis, which focuses on observing and criticizing the provisions and regulation which link to the availability of COVID-19 vaccine, and aims to continuously build and advise to reconstruct the law to be more comprehensive. Next slide, please. To answer the first question, which is the current cooperation initiated by Indonesia to ensure the COVID-19 vaccine availability, there are 4 major cooperation initiated by Indonesia. Firstly, the Memorandum of Understanding or MOU signing between the Ministry of Health and the UNICEF on procurement services to obtain affordable COVID-19 vaccine. Another MOU signing with Imperial College London on partnership, research and innovation for COVID-19 vaccine. LOI or letter of intent signing with AstraZeneca plc on pre-order commitment of 100 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine, which is a huge number. And the government of Indonesia also have joined the WHO program, which is Access to COVID-19 Tools or ICT Accelerator, for supporting the COVID-19 Vaccines Global Access or COVAX vaccine program. However, we identify that all of this cooperation is all about how to secure the stock of vaccine by only buying. So we identify that all of this cooperation is about the short-term policy. Fortunately, the government of Indonesia have already prepared their long-term policy, which is the cultivation of Merah Putih vaccine. It was cultivated and procured by the Eijkman Institute for Molecular Biology, Indonesian Institute of Sciences, or you may recognize it as LIPI, and Indonesian Food and Drugs Agency, or you may recognize it as BPOM. Next slide, please. Normally, according to a study by GSK, it took 26 months to procure a vaccine. However, in this stage, it is only needed 12 to 16 months by surpassing 3 stages of clinical trial before attaining emergency use authorization based on law number 13/2016 on patent. Next slide, please. So, to answer the second question, which is the urgency of regulating COVID-19 vaccine, it is proposed to control the proponent factors of a successful COVID-19 vaccine immunization and sustainable availability of COVID-19 vaccine supply, which includes first, the mechanism of procurement of vaccine, region roadmap, which is very vital for the vaccine distribution section, economic considerations, which includes the vaccine procurement and the implementation of vaccination, and surveillance and the enforcement of vaccination is very vital to ensure that the regulation is fully enforced, which needs a strong synergy between central and regional government to create a transparency on monitoring system. Next slide, please. So, To answer the third question about what is the Indonesia's regulation on availability of COVID-19 vaccine, on October 2020, the government have already released the Presidential Regulation number 99/2020 on the procurement of vaccine and vaccination implementation to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic. However, we identify several provisions which could be considered as a loophole that urge us to recommend the government to create a new policy that could, as a derivative of this presidential regulation, which can cover all those loopholes that could be more tangible, elaborative, comprehensive, and holistically that could be implemented in the society. Next slide, please. So we identify that in the first article, the extent of procurement of vaccine and vaccination implementation covers the procurement, implementation of vaccination, funding procedure, and support and facility from the ministry and institution. We acknowledge that sometimes the first article defines something as the base of defining the other article. However, as we have already identified that it only mentions, but there is a lack of detailed explanation in several aspects, especially on the procurement services and the implementation of vaccination. You will see the reason why I stated this. Next slide, please. Further explained in the Article 4 that the implementation of procurement of COVID-19 vaccine will be done through governmental institutions and with international bodies. But that's it. Done. There is no clear expression on the mechanism of the sustainability of vaccine procurement. As we have stated before that the government has already initiated two terms, which is short-term and long-term policy on procurement services, the regulation should deeply regulates on the harmonization of the vaccine procurement mechanism, how they can harmonize between short-term and long-term policy. When are we going to use the short-term policy? When are we going to stop the short-term policy and going on to the long-term policy to use our own procured vaccine? Next slide, please. Moving on to the Article 10, which stated that the price for same type of COVID-19 vaccine can be varied depending on the sort of provider and the extent time of the contract. This again is a very controversial article due to the fact that it creates a confusion on setting the exact price of the COVID-19 vaccine itself. Also, it was stated in the same regulation in Article 22 that the expenses for COVID-19 vaccine procurement and the vaccination implementation is the part of economic expenses on saving the economy from crisis as referred to the law number 2/2020. However, again, there is no express statement whether the vaccine are going to be free or is it going to be paid. If it's paid, then there is an option on setting exact price or at least minimum and maximum price for the vaccine. And for your information, the government also ever released an online questionnaire that you can see it on covid19.go.id, which includes question on vaccine price. However, sadly, the result is not manifested into the regulation. And as you can see, if you open the questionnaire, they already taken down the questionnaire, so we don't really know what is actually the purpose of the questionnaire itself. Moving on to the next slide, please. On the next article, Article 13, it was stated that the implementation of COVID-19 vaccination covers criteria and vaccine recipient priority scale, timeline and stages, and standard of vaccination treatment. However, again, they skip the explanation on the distribution mechanism. They are more into the implementation, like how can you do the implementation of vaccination without regulating the distribution firstly. One of the recommendations that we can take into account is that is an existing regulation, which is Ministry of Health Regulation number 42/2013 on immunization, that actually we can harmonize it with an international framework or recommendations such as the WHO recommendation, immunization supply chain and logistics, which very detailedly explain on the phases of distribution mechanism and how to preserve the quality of vaccine before going on to the implementation procedure. Next slide, please. Also, we would like to request the government to reconsider the mass vaccination method with several considerations, which is there should be a clear scheme to ensure that it will not create new cluster of COVID-19 transmission due to the fact that mass vaccination could higher the possibility of mass gathering, and there should be a vaccine recipient priority scale due to the fact that we should immunize those who are very vulnerable of COVID-19 at the first place, for example, like the frontline workers, health workers, and strategizing distribution by region mapping is very important to ensure that the distribution could be holistically distributed to every part of the country. Assessing potential risks of implementing mass vaccination is very important, which needs synergy between regional and central government for effective monitoring and quick response. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we would like to recommend the government to create a new regulation as a derivative of this presidential regulation, which covers a detailed explanation in all aspects in Article 1, as we have stated before, harmonizing vaccine procurement mechanism, explaining details on distribution mechanism by recommending harmonizing existing regulation with international framework, and reconsidering and strategizing mass vaccination method. All in all, we believe that if the government could take this into account, it will create an effective regulation that could be fully implemented, which is tangible to the society. Thank you. Next slide.
Okay, thank you very much for Ms.